All right, so some countries have winner-take-all, single-member districts. Some have PR or proportional representation. Here's my next point. You can end up with different outcomes depending on what actually happens in these elections. For example, you can get something like what you have in the United States, where you have a two-party system. That means when it comes down to seating people in, let's say, the House of Representatives, there are basically two parties represented. In the US, it's the Republicans and the Democrats. Now, to be very clear, that's not that there are no other parties, right? We often have election where in addition to the Republican and Democrat, there's some other party, a Green Party candidate, a Libertarian, or something like that, right? So it's not that they don't exist, but they almost never win, right? And what I'll say is that is not inevitably how it works. There are lots of countries, and I'll say again, most of Europe, right, where there are more than two parties, so-called multiple party systems or multi-party systems, where you could have 4, 5, 6, 7 different parties represented in parliament. For example, in Israel, you could have a situation like this. And Israel, if you follow the news, has had wild elections in the last year or so. But anyway, you have a situation like this where you have, 11 different parties represented. I've seen the Knesset have more parties than this. Look how many different parties there are, right? And for someone like me who's used to the American two-party system, this is like, my head is exploding to imagine this many parties. So the question becomes why? Like, why do some countries have two-party systems like we do, right? Why do some countries have 4, 5, 6, or 11, right? Let's go back to interest, values, and institutions, right? Interests, perhaps different countries have different interest groups. For example, let's think of like the United States or a lot of countries like in the late 1800s, right? Juniors did this relatively recently at the beginning of the semester. You have different like kind of blocks with different interests. The farmers have their own interests. Organized labor, working class people have their own interests. Business owners have their own interests. And so you can imagine based on that, that might dictate the number of parties or something like that, right? It could be values. So you might be, well, there are certain really important value-laden issues like, I'll use abortion as an example, or even, the role of government in the economy, right? That comes down to values in a lot of ways. Maybe it's just, those values are distributed in the population in a certain way, and so people naturally coalesce into two different groups. Or in another country, maybe there's a reason that the values are split in more directions, maybe because of it having a bunch of different ethnic groups. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's the reason. I bring these up, and I don't think self-interest and values are irrelevant to this, but I'm actually going to make the case that institutions are pretty darn important here, and in particular, the election system that you have. Because, let me make an observation. I did some number crunching, and based on the data I had a few years ago when I did this, the average number of effective parties in Parliament, that is not just how many parties exist, because there might be lots of parties, but like if you look at how many parties are regularly represented in Parliament, if you look at single member districts, you end up with an average of 2.73 parties per country, right? If you look at proportional representation countries, they have on average of 4.5 parties in their parliament. That's a pretty significant difference, right, between those two. Why does proportional representation lead to more parties than single member districts? This is a question that you will be asked. This phenomenon, by the way, where single-member district systems tend to be two-party systems and proportional representation systems tend to be multi-party systems, is called Duverger's law. There's a dude named Duverger who studied this and popularized this idea, I think, back in the 50s. And let me just give you one hint. It's not that we actually don't have parties. We do. For example, in 2012, this was the ballot. There weren't just two parties. You could choose from 6, except most of these parties would never win, right? So let's think of the role of institutions. And here is the little hint I'll give you. In a recent election a couple years ago in the Netherlands, they had an election where, as you can see, there were, 3, 6, 12 different parties represented. One of those parties, I kid you not, is the Party for the Animals. Party for the Dieren, right? How does someone get elected to parliament for the Party for the Animals. I'm all for animal rights, but who would vote for that, right, over some other party? Well, let's think about why in a proportional representation system, which is what the Dutch have, that vote might make more sense than in a single-member district system. With that, I will leave you be and think about that question. What about that Party for the Animals? So the final thing I'll say is that we have talked a bunch about institutions. I'm sure your head's spinning. I hope I kept it moderately interesting, but I would just say these are really important for shaping political outcomes. It is not just a transparent result of what voters want, what politicians want. It really matters what system is in place. And when we come to class on Monday, I'm going to lead discussion going through these things and trying to unpack the role of institutions. So hopefully you're armed to have good discussions. Thanks.